I've been asking around people that I've been talking with during the week about this man Nehemiah. And I discovered that quite a number of people don't know very much about him. And I discovered some preachers don't like him very much. So I thought I would take just a minute or two to sketch in the background that might bring the story a little bit more alive than it has been so far. Let me just quickly put in place a historical background. The city of Jerusalem and its temple were destroyed, and the Jews, the top brass anyway, were deported to Babylon under that great king with the great name Nebuchadnezzar. Then he fell, and the Persian Empire came in, and somewhere about 70 years later, the Persian Empire, Cyrus, issued a decree allowing the people to go back to Jerusalem. Now, there were 3 stages in the return of the Jews to Jerusalem. First, a few of them got back and they rebuilt the altar and recommenced the sacrifices. You'll read that in Ezra 1-3. Then there was a lull, and another crowd came and were stimulated by prophets to build the temple. First the altar and the sacrifices, then quite a number of years later the temple. And just after that, Ezra came and reintroduced the law. Now, quite a bit beyond that, I thought we were doing quite well. Quite a bit later than that, we have the story that we're on today, which is the rebuilding of the walls. So have you got it? First they were kicked out, and some of them got back. Number 1, they built an altar and sacrifices. Number 2, they built a temple. And about 100 years after all this began, as much as that, Nehemiah is back building the walls. Now, the other thing I've asked people, and they've not been very sure about it, who wrote the book of Nehemiah? You didn't shout it out. He wrote it himself. It's a journal of a short section of this man's life. A journal of 2 long leaves that he was given by his employer, the king and queen, where he had a top job. We don't know anything about Nehemiah's birth or his boyhood, and apart from his father, we don't know his mother, and we don't know anything about his earlier life. And we don't know anything about what happened to him afterwards. We don't know how he died or when he died. We know that in between his first and his ultimate return, he had 1 return trip to Persia. But all we know about Nehemiah, he has told us himself. It's his own story. So what does he tell us? And what do we know from the history of the period? Well, he was a 2nd or 3rd generation immigrant, or a diaspora person, as we're beginning to call them today. He was the son or grandson, might even be the great-grandson of Daniel's generation. You know, Daniel and the lion's den and all that. So we're 2, maybe 3 generations after that. So he was descended from an elite Jewish family, because only the elite were deported to Babylon. and they were selected for forcible deportation in order to cripple Judah and prevent it from rising again, and in order to use their brains in the imperial service, first of Nebuchadnezzar and then the Persians. And I'm going to guess, just to give you a picture, that he was probably about 39 or 40 when all this happened. I've nothing to go on to make that true, but it helps just to think of a person in that age. Nehemiah had never seen Jerusalem. He'd never been to his own country of Judah. He had only heard stories from his parents, and these would be pretty thin, from his grandparents, which would be pretty far removed, and maybe even his great-grandfather. The only city he had known were the big cities, the big modern cities of the magnificent Persian Empire. But he had become a highly successful, high-class, employed immigrant. He had made it. He had it good. He was still not free to return to his own home, even if he wanted to, but he had risen to the top. Now, I find him to be an unusual kind of immigrant. The thing that really got me going was when I read that the king and the queen whom he had served, I presume for a number of years, had never seen him sad. Isn't that something? Could that be said about us and our employer? That they'd never seen us sad over years? Quite remarkable. So he was a very self-possessed person, making the best he could of his situation. Completely loyal, or he would never have had the job. Very brave, to risk being poisoned at every meal. And apparently he had adjusted completely and was comfortably settled in another country in a top job. He was in the foreign country that had taken over the government of his own country from the Babylonians, who had besieged and destroyed utterly his city. So as far as Nehemiah was concerned, Jerusalem was a long way away, about 1,000 miles, and a long time ago. And he was a seemingly happy man who had never been seen as anything else to his overlords. Then one day, out of character, he appeared devastated. So much so that both the king and the queen noticed and commented on it. So what had happened to this serene personality, this man who had it all made? Because of what followed, we need to know. Well, he tells us, one day, out of the blue and from the middle of nowhere, a brother turned up with some friends who came from Judah, his brother from Jerusalem. And of course, you've got to always welcome the relatives, no matter how long it is since you've seen them, and they were welcomed. And he asked them about the city, and he asked them about the country. He knew that some had already returned and were getting busy about some things back there, and he asked how they were getting on. And it was their news that got to him. And there were two elements to it that really made the difference. One was very real and practical. Read the story. Two words keep popping up. Some of you know that I use the method of discourse analysis to prompt my preaching. And when words keep propping up in a speech or in an article or in a journal, you know they're quite important. And what were the words that kept cropping up? Walls and gates. Walls and gates. Walls and gates. Read it when you get home and you'll find they occur quite often. This pinpoints what this man was about in Jerusalem. Now, walls are about safety, to keep the enemy out. Gates are about liberty, so that you can go up it and in unhindered. When Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem, is described in the last book of Revelation, you remember what it says? The gates were never closed on that heavenly city. So, it's about safety and liberty. Rebuilding defences. And what about our city of Nairobi? Last year I spoke to a man further up the road here about the post-election violence. And he said two things that stuck with me. First one was, he said, Tom, we feel cheated. Because we were getting on quite well. We'd gone to school with people of other tribes. We'd gone to university. We'd begun to work with them. We were living in the same housing estates. And we seemed to be getting on quite well and making it. And then the PEV came and we were put back. I don't know how many years. But the other thing was the one that really got to me. He says, now I have to say, I am a Kalenjin, but am I safe? Or I am a Kikuyu, but am I safe? Or I'm a Luo, but am I safe? Or I'm a Somali, but am I safe? And so for all the range of lovely tribes that we have in Kenya, changes followed that. Changes in the people who occupied housing on their housing estates, whether they had gates or not. Some people were sent to Coventry, is the expression we use in English when you give people the cold shoulder and tell them you would rather they weren't around. That's happened here. When I came to Nairobi, 1959, it was a segregated city, residentially. I think it's now a more segregated city, residentially, than it was 5 years ago. 50. Let me ask you, do others contribute to your sense of safety and support? Let me ask you, do you contribute to other people's sense of safety and your support of them in such a way that they feel better for it? For Nehemiah is about safety and liberty. Now, there was another thing. Nehemiah, this immigrant who had it all, when he got the message, it was like this in the Good News Bible. Foreigners who lived nearby looked down on our relatives back in Jerusalem. And when I heard all this, this is a man who had never been seen sad by his employers. When I heard all this, I sat down and wept. The man who had never been sad sat down and cried his eyes out. He sobbed uncontrollably. For several days I mourned. I went off my food, I did not eat, and I prayed to God. Now this is describing a very deep emotional experience. A man who was never sad suddenly plunged into that sort of thing. Now Pastor Shiramba and Omosola have both spoken to us about the 4 months in which he prayed before he made his approach to the King. But these 4 months were the turnaround time for this man. He eventually puts it all into words in chapter 2:17 that we read today. He's telling the people to rise and build. Why? So that we may no longer suffer disgrace. The issue was shame, and this is about removing disgrace. He held that his people were in great shame in a city that was still in shambles after scores of years of neglect. The picture I have in my mind that's painted here is rather like the things we saw on our television screen last year when the hurricane hit the Philippines and destroyed these villages. Things piled on one another and no order at all. The city was still in its shambles after years and years of neglect, and they had done nothing about it. The temple had been rebuilt, and I presume was operating, although it's an interesting thing to me that Nehemiah never talks about the temple. Only once is the temple mentioned in the book of Nehemiah, and it's somebody else who talks about it. The rest of the city was as if it had been bombed beyond recognition. The people went around feeling harassed, despised by their neighbors, cowering, eyes on the ground, ashamed to be Jews. And here was Nehemiah, way 1,000 miles away in the capital city, a man who was looked up to, a man in a top position, proud he had made it to the top, and he had the ear and the confidence of the king and the queen, and he could get to anybody he wanted to ask them anything that occurred to him. And he got this message from his brother and his friends, and he was convicted about his complacency. And I can imagine about many other things. In the story, as we read it previous Sundays, Nehemiah uses words like sin, and sins, and sinned, and unfaithful, and failing to keep not just the moral commandments, but the religious statutes and ordinances. These had to do with their not worshipping, not praying, not meeting for worship. They were not observing any religious practices. And that's what got to him. At least that's what he says. Friends, this is a classic case of deep conviction of sin. And that's what turned Nehemiah around. That's what took him from being the well-dressed, suave, cultivated king's cupbearer to the king, to a man riding in the night on a donkey over ruins that he could hardly get past. He didn't know about his people, and he had not bothered to find out. He was ashamed. He was basking in the warm glow of achievement in getting this high position, and his own people were looked down upon. He was ashamed. He had everything he needed and could get anything he wanted, and speak to anyone he wanted to speak to. And they, his people back in Jerusalem, were sentenced to perpetual hardship and poverty, from which they could do nothing to get out. And there were other immigrants that the conquerors had brought in, the imperialists, to settle the land that the exiles had vacated, and they ruled the roost and saw to it that the Jews were kept down and in the place that they could. Nehemiah was ashamed. He could have done something, he did not. Now he was helpless, and wished he had not been so self-centered, always striving for more, always for more. And when he wanted to do something about it, there was nothing he could do. He couldn't go back in time and change it all. Perhaps he even remembered the time when he made his decision to go for success and advancement as the goal of his life, whatever the cost, and now regretted it. The temptation that came to him, the opportunity that came to him, whatever it was that took him off track and put him into this complacent top job that did nothing for his people. Have you been at a point like that? This is deep conviction of sin. Have you been at a point like that when the only thing that measures up to your abject need is forgiveness from the Lord? You can't fix it. You can't change it. The damage is done. The after effects are moving, and you can do nothing about it. That's when forgiveness is the only thing needed, and needed beyond anything else. I've been at that point more than once, and I can remember them all. As an old man, I know the road there now more easily. This is the kind of thing that Jesus was talking about when he said that when the Holy Spirit comes, he will convict of sin. He'll break us until the only thing it will do is forgiveness. It's not a question of putting your hand up or walking forward or signing a card. It's discovering that you're useless and it's too late to do anything about it. And there's only one remedy, and that's the remedy that Jesus Christ died for our sins and is prepared to blot them all out and has paid the price with his blood. This is what Paul is talking about when he said, looking back, the things that were gain to me, I count but loss for Christ. This is why the death of Jesus on the cross is the only refuge for a sin-sick soul. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Some of you don't. And you're still where Nehemiah was. Complacent at the top or at the bottom, it doesn't matter, but complacent. Without ever having reached in to discover the depths of sin in your soul. This was the driving power behind Nehemiah's great project. And it was infectious enough and empowering enough to get the wall built. And when he said, let us rebuild the wall so that we may no more suffer disgrace, they responded out of shame, because they felt it too. And they got to work. That brings me to chapter 3. We've looked at restoring defences. We've looked at recovering from disgrace. Now I want to speak about revealing differences. And you're going to have some fun with this. At first sight, Nehemiah 3 is a very boring chapter, and when I saw it running order for the service this morning, I was dismayed that we could think about reading these 30-odd verses. It would have bored us to tears. It's full of strange names of people and places. It repeats the same phrases over and over again. I used to think it was a very boring chapter 2 until I was given here in the 60s by a member of the congregation a gift. She was leaving and she wanted to say a thank you for the ministry. She lived over in Woodley Estate. She was brought to the church by a visitation program that we had when the first building was opened. And she asked if I would like something and could tell her what to buy. So I said, well, I don't have an atlas of the Bible. Remember, this time I was about 32. Now I found in this atlas a map of Jerusalem, quite a big one. Jerusalem at the time of Nehemiah. So I took my coloured pencils out, which was a 4-colour pencil, and I transferred the names from Nehemiah chapter 3 onto the atlas in my atlas of the Bible, and it all fitted. I still have it. Come to Oxford, I'll show it to you. But it was done in the study around at the Tobacco House. I had my eyes opened and my mind instructed about work among the Lord's people by that little exercise. And I'm going to summarize it for you now, not read the chapter. First of all, there were people who did unaccustomed work, messing around, restoring a wall, rebuilding doors and gates and whatnot. Not the nicest of jobs. The wall was not built by people insisting that they stick to their own job. I'll not take you all through the references. If you're interested, you can check them out at home. But there were different kinds of people involved. The high priest is the first one mentioned. And then the priest. And then the Levites. I count for 5 of the groups of people that are mentioned there. Then there are perfumers. One translation has it apothecaries, who said pharmacists. Then there were what are called rulers of half a district. Something to do with a ward here, I imagine. 8 of these. Though they were used to running the district, they got their jackets or whatever else they wore off, got the sleeves rolled up, and they got into business. The rulers. And I was so pleased to find the goldsmiths there. When I think of a goldsmith, I think of a man in a small shop with round shoulders and a glass, looking through his glass at jewels. This lot of goldsmiths were rebuilding the wall, tearing down broken things and putting them back up. Oh yes, and there's one further lot of people. The merchants were there. What will be a shard? You see, they didn't insist on job demarcation in the rebuilding of the wall. People had a mind to work and they did whatever was needing to be done. So that's the first thing, those who did unaccustomed work. Then there's those who did detailed work. This comes out in these gates that I mentioned. There were many gates, 9 that I have spotted. There was a sheep gate, a fish gate, an oak gate, a valley gate, a dung gate, a fountain gate, a water gate, a horse gate, and a mustard gate. And they all had to have something done, have you noticed, about the beams and the bolts and the bars and the doors. Now, if you go through them all, you'll find that only one actually deals with all 4. Most of them deal with 3, and some actually only deal with 2. quotation by one of Britain's High Commissioners to Malawi in the early days when he said, "Commitment is the last 5%. There were folk who did all 4 of these things. There were folk who were content with 3. There were folk who got away with 2. And there were folk who barely managed 1. Is it any different? And then there were people who did no work. Unaccustomed work, detailed work, no work. This is verse 5. People from Tekoa. Do you remember who came from Tekoa? Amos was from Tekoa. And it says, their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work. Thankfully, their people didn't follow their example, and if you read in verse 27, you'll find that the people from Tekoa actually did the job. But for these nobles in Tekoa, work was beneath them. Do you know people like that? I came across a phrase in a novel I'm reading by Tom Clancy at the moment, where he calls this kind of person status-conscious fools. They're around. The nobles who wouldn't put their shoulder to the work. Are you one of these? Won't get your hands dirty. When we're like that, we have forgotten about the Jesus who took a basin and a towel and washed his disciples' feet. Then there were people who did selfish work. This comes out most clearly in the Good News Bible. There are 6 groups, and they built the section which was near to their own house. Now, that was necessary, of course. But I keep asking myself, why had Nehemiah feel he needed to register it? After all, it was a long wall, there were many parts, he could have skipped it. But no, he registered if they only built near their house. And I'm asking myself, is he commending them? Or is he hinting that their eyes didn't see further than those? Or is he just recording a fact? When it occurs 6 times, I think there may be a meaning in it. And then there were people who did double work. Hanun and Hanani built the next section, a second one, it says, verse 30. And you check back, and you'll find that Hanun and Hanani had already done a stint earlier in the wall, and now they're doing an extra one. People who do double work. And oddly enough, Hanun happens to be the only one who gets a measuring tape put on his section, and we're told in the Good News Bible that he built the wall to the distance of 440 meters, or in your more in the NRSV, for example, it's 1,000 cubits. Friends, is it any different today? Could we not split this congregation into these 5 categories? This morning, what category would you be in? Would you be in the unaccustomed work, the detailed work, the no work, the selfish work, or the double work? We're all here as volunteers in the Church of Jesus Christ, unpaid, giving of ourselves. But make no mistake, as Paul says, every man's work will be tried what sort it is. 1 Corinthians 3:11. So we built the wall, it said in the last verse that Noah read to us, to half its height. Because what? The people had a mind to work. Recovery, determination. The lead of the honest, penitent, repentant Nehemiah and his practical understanding and planning and forethought galvanized the whole people into rapid people that had been delaying for years and years, and they finished repairing the wall. Does anybody know how long it took them? 52 days. Now, where are the walls of Nairobi broken down and the gates destroyed? There's no use telling a nice story about Nehemiah and Jerusalem if it doesn't translate to Nairobi and today. It does. Where are the walls of Nairobi broken down and the gates destroyed? Now, I think there are probably different answers to that question. But I believe that the walls are most broken down and the gates destroyed in the slums of Kenya. 6 million people live in slums in this beautiful land. And I've set myself to try and inspire something to be done. At 84, I can't do much myself. I'm going to try to inspire others. So we've worked out together, a few of us, a project called the Circles of Care, where we hope to have created a circle of care around every slum in Nairobi by December this year. Started it. Now, if any of you wish to have a description of that, I'm happy to send it to you by email, and I will stand at this door here, and I'll give my calling card to any of you who want it. But please only ask if you're ready to do something about the slums. And what are the things that need to be done? Here's a list from the paper, and it should come up on the screen if they're, yeah, well. What needs to be done in the slums? Feeding the hungry, providing piped water, visiting the sick, clothing the naked. Ever heard of these things? Welcoming the stranger, visiting prisoners, helping the disabled, sanitation and drainage, road improvements, both internal and access roads, rubbish collection, disposal and use, or use, improvements to existing structures, they're called, dwellings, schools, medical services, social services, financial services, installing electricity, organising sports facilities, establishing of choirs, the forming of bands, other work opportunities, providing security. It goes on, doesn't it? The uncovering and reporting on the situation on land ownership, structure ownership, and tennis stand grounds. If these things all started to be done in every slum in Kenya, it would make this a true year of Jubilee, or as Isaiah and Jesus called it, an acceptable year of the Lord. But one further thing has suggested itself to me, both from the story of Nehemiah and my reflection on the slums. Is it not time in Kenya that we had a different kind of Christian union? Many of you know about Christian unions in schools and the KSCF and all of that. Wonderful story. Starting in 1958, the year before I came, I was there almost at the beginning. Started with 20 Christian unions in secondary schools. They now have 6,000 plus. But we need another kind of Christian union. I would like to see a Christian union of carpenters, of painters and decorators, a Christian union of electricians, a Christian union of plumbers, of roofers, of bricklayers, of glaziers, of rubbish collectors, and road menders and builders, road builders, sport coaches, gardeners, music coaches, plus the professional associations of architects, quantity surveyors, and a list as long as your arm. with the Christians who would be in that Christian union of these Mahuti, we could do the job. Couldn't do it 52 days. But the church has the means, the gifts, the resources, and the organization to take this on and do it. I have no doubt about that. There's only one thing missing, and that's the will. And with Nehemiah, the will only came when he was convicted of his complacency in the light of the need of others and found mercy again in his covenant-keeping God. So would you help me to test this idea? If you know a person in one of these trades or fully active, still working or retired, who might be interested in pioneering a new kind of Christian union that would promote apprenticeships in the slums, would you talk to them about it? And if they're interested, get them to write to me, or get your permission, their permission for you to write to me and give me their contact details. You too can get my email from my card, or from Mary Ann at the office. And so I end. Arise! Let us begin to repair the walls and gates